The only thing more painful than being unseen is realizing you made yourself invisible for someone who never looked. She gave him 10 years of her life, her youth, her dreams, her everything. In return, he erased her, turned her into a ghost in the home they once built together. All while he flaunted his stunning mistress Marissa right before her eyes. He believed she was weak, ordinary, and utterly dependent. But he was wrong. After 5 years of silence, she returned to his world, no longer the woman they had discarded, but a vision of power and grace. He and his mistress didn't recognize her. They barely even looked at her, dismissed her like a stranger. They didn't see the brilliance they had forged from cruelty, not until it was far, far too late. This is the story of Evelyn's revenge. The clinking of ice in Ethan's whiskey glass was the only sound breaking the dense silence of their Manhattan penthouse. Evelyn had come to hate that sound. To her, it meant shame. It meant another Tuesday night of being ignored. Another evening where her husband, Ethan Whitmore, a name celebrated in tech and finance, treated her like an accessory he no longer noticed. Evelyn sat across from him on a cream-colored sofa that cost more than her father's first annual salary. She was holding a book, or pretending to. The words blurred into meaningless black swirls against a white page. Her real attention was fixed on him, on the hard line of his jaw, the faintly cruel smile that played on his lips as he stared at his phone. She didn't need to wonder who he was texting. Marissa Hale. Just thinking the name made her stomach turn. Even without saying it aloud, it left a sour taste in her mouth. Marissa was everything Evelyn was not. Loud, flawless, magnetic, with a laugh that filled rooms and a body sculpted by personal trainers and a nutritionist on retainer. She was a brand consultant, whatever that meant, a glamorous title that seemed to include endless parties and being photographed on Ethan's arm. Their affair wasn't hidden. It was proudly paraded. He'd brought Marissa to charity galas, product launches, and even to their family's Christmas dinner, where Evelyn's mother had to pretend not to notice the possessive hand Marissa placed on Ethan's back. "Did you need something?" Ethan's voice cut through the quiet. He didn't even look up from his phone. Evelyn's heart made its familiar, painful thud. It was the voice of a man annoyed by a fly buzzing near his ear. She lowered her book. "I was just wondering if you've had time to think more about the fundraiser for the Children's Hospital, the one I'm helping to organize. We need to finalize the corporate sponsorship list by Friday." He finally lifted his eyes, and the look in them was pure, unfiltered boredom. The kind of look that said, "You and your little projects are irrelevant. Send the list to my assistant, Rachel. She'll handle it," Ethan said with a flick of his hand, already back to scrolling through his phone. The faint smile crept back onto his lips. Another message from Marissa, no doubt. Evelyn felt the familiar chill settle over her. It wasn't rage anymore. That fire had died long ago, leaving only the pale ash of quiet resignation. She had once been Evelyn Brooks, a bright-eyed graduate in art history, deeply passionate about preservation and cultural restoration. When she met Ethan, he was a force, confident, magnetic, unstoppable. He'd swept her off her feet in a blur of charisma and charm. He said he loved her quiet strength, called it a balm to his hectic world. But 10 years of marriage had stripped away the illusion. He hadn't loved her serenity. He loved her silence. He loved that she didn't push back, that she ran the house like a perfect assistant, that she was a visually pleasing but entirely forgettable background to his dazzling, high-powered life. Bit by bit, she had faded, like a watercolor painting left out in the rain. Her wardrobe was full of tasteful, muted tones, safe, subtle, invisible. Her hair was always tucked neatly into a low bun, practical, forgettable. She hadn't bought a new lipstick in 3 years. What would be the point? The only person she wanted to notice her didn't see her anymore. The true fracture came 6 months ago. It was their 10th anniversary. Evelyn had spent weeks organizing the perfect evening. She'd booked a private chef, filled the condo with white lilies, Ethan's favorite, worn the soft blue dress he once said made her eyes look like the ocean. He came home late. The scent of expensive perfume clung to him. Marissa's signature, a suffocating gardenia that made Evelyn's stomach twist. He didn't notice the flowers, or the chef, or the dress. He walked straight to the bedroom, yanking off his tie. "Long day," he muttered, not as an apology but as a declaration. "I'm wiped, gonna call it a night." "Ethan," she whispered, her voice cracking, "it's our anniversary." He stopped, his back to her, his shoulders lifted with a sigh so deep it felt rehearsed. "Evelyn, for God's sake, it's just a date. We've been married 10 years. Don't make this a thing." "Evelyn, for God's sake, it's just a day. We've been married for 10 years. What's the big deal?" He finally turned to look at her, his eyes cold and sharp. "Don't be so needy. It's unbecoming." The word hit her like a slap. Needy. Her? The woman who never asked for anything, who swallowed his public affair with Marissa and still kept the house running like a well-oiled machine, who stayed in the shadows so he could keep shining in the spotlight. Something in her snapped that night. The last flicker of hope, the foolish belief that maybe the man she fell for was still buried somewhere in Ethan, was extinguished. Now, watching him text his mistress in the very home she had so meticulously built for them, the fracture inside her finally broke clean. She stood up. The sudden motion made him glance up, irritated. "What now?" "I'm going to my sister's for a few days," she said, her voice startlingly calm. The decision felt less like a leap and more like stepping onto solid ground for the first time in years. Ethan shrugged, barely lifting his gaze from the glowing screen. "Fine. The guest room sheets are clean." He assumed, as always, that her life existed around his schedule, that she'd be back, that she was going nowhere. He didn't ask why. He didn't care. Evelyn walked into their cavernous bedroom, passing rows of Ethan's tailored suits and Italian shirts. On her side of the closet, dull shades of beige, gray, and navy. She didn't pack those. Instead, she reached for the few pieces that still felt like her. A pair of worn jeans, a paint-stained t-shirt, her old sketchbook. She grabbed her passport, her personal debit card with what little she had quietly saved, and a small, tarnished silver locket her grandmother had once given her. As she passed the living room, Ethan was still glued to his phone, bathed in its blue glow. He didn't look up. He didn't say goodbye. She closed the heavy door of the penthouse behind her. The click echoed like the quiet closing of a chapter that had been begging to end. "Have a good evening, Mrs. Whitmore." The doorman, a kind man named Martin, tipped his hat. "You too, Martin," she said with a smile, her first real one in months. Outside, the night air was cool and clean. She didn't go to her sister's. She walked to the nearest ATM, withdrew every dollar of her savings, and hailed a cab. "Penn Station, please," she said, her voice steady. As the cab pulled away, she took one last look at the glass tower where she had slowly lost herself. Ethan wouldn't notice she was gone. Not now. Maybe not ever. She was gone. Or at least, she would be. Not right away. Not until his shirts weren't perfectly ironed, or his favorite brand of coffee stopped appearing like clockwork in the kitchen. But by then, she'd be long gone. She wasn't Mrs. Whitmore anymore. She was just Evelyn. And for the first time in 10 years, that felt like enough. The ghost was leaving the building, and she wasn't looking back. The first year was the hardest. Evelyn didn't disappear into some glamorous, Instagram-worthy rebirth. There were no fairy tale comebacks, no luxury wellness retreats, or picture-perfect revenge photo shoots. She fled to a place Ethan would never think to look, a small, worn-down city in the Midwest, a town of red brick, shuttered factories, and rusted train tracks. Her grandmother had immigrated there decades ago. Evelyn had only visited once as a child, but something about its raw honesty, the unpretentious, hard-working energy, felt safe. She rented a third-floor walk-up that smelled of dust and old wood. It was cramped, drafty, and the stairs creaked like a haunted house. But it was hers. For the first few weeks, all she did was sleep. The weight of 10 years of quiet misery had settled into her bones, and now, finally alone, she let herself collapse under it. There were no calendars to manage, no dinners to prep, no cold silences to navigate, or sidelong glares to decode. The stillness that had once suffocated her in Manhattan now became her refuge. Her savings, which had felt reassuring in that ATM screen, vanished quicker than she imagined. Rent, food, utilities. Reality crept in. Panic began to claw at her. She was 34. With a decade-long blank space on her resume and a degree in art history that felt like an artifact in a world of tech and hustle. One rainy afternoon, staring into the fogged-up mirror of her tiny bathroom, she confronted herself. The woman looking back at her had pale, blotchy skin, dull eyes, lifeless hair. Her jaw trembled. She leaned in closer, half hoping the mirror would lie to her, but it didn't. Every crease of fatigue, every dull flicker in her stare reflected back her truth. She didn't recognize herself. Not the girl who had once dreamed in brushstrokes and color palettes. Not the woman who had once believed in love. Just a shell. A stranger. A ghost she hadn't realized she'd become. She looked like someone who had stopped being a person and become a placeholder. That day, something shifted. Not a makeover, not some movie montage, just a choice. She would not let Ethan Whitmore write the ending to her story. The first step was small. She got a job waiting tables at a local diner, the Corner Spot. A busy place where the smell of bacon and burnt coffee clung to your clothes. The work was brutal. Her feet ached, her hands stung from dish soap and heat, and the tips barely stretched far enough to cover rent and a basic grocery run. But for the first time in years, she felt real. People saw her, really saw her. They looked her in the eye. They smiled. They said thank you. Have a good one. They'd call out as she refilled mugs and cleared plates. She wasn't invisible anymore. She became Ellie, the quiet waitress who always remembered who took their coffee black. The physical demands of the job began to change her. The puffiness in her face gave way to sharp cheekbones. Constant movement replaced years of stillness. Her body began to tone in a way no forgotten gym membership ever had. She walked everywhere, exploring the city one block at a time, feeling her legs grow stronger with each step. With her first few paychecks, she didn't splurge on designer shoes or beauty products. She bought paint, canvas, oils, brushes. Each night after her shift, she'd climb the 3 flights of stairs to her apartment, turn on music, and paint. At first, the canvases were chaos, dark swirls of black and gray. They bled pain, fury, shame. She didn't paint to impress. She painted to survive. It was a messy, painful exorcism of the decades she had buried herself in silence. Some nights she wept while painting, the brush trembling in her hand, tears mixing with the scent of turpentine. It wasn't just about putting color on canvas. It was like clawing her way back to herself with every stroke. Every smear of gray or crimson was a confession she hadn't had the strength to speak aloud. Then, little by little, color returned. Not all at once, but in small, cautious bursts. She started painting what she saw on her walks, the city that was slowly becoming hers, the rusted lattice of an old fire escape, the spray-painted mural on the back wall of an abandoned theater, the rainbow light refracting through broken stained glass in a forgotten church window. She was reconnecting with the thing that had once set her soul alight. Art. The very thing Ethan used to call her cute little hobby. One morning, a regular at the diner, a sweet elderly man named Mr. Harrison, who ran a small furniture shop down the street, noticed the faint smudges of paint under her nails. "You an artist?" he asked. She hesitated, then nodded. "Bring something by," he said. "Let me see." A week later, he stood in the middle of her apartment-turned-studio, gazing quietly at the pieces that lined every inch of wall space. Finally, he spoke, his voice low and a little choked. "My dear, you don't see rust and ruin. You see stories. You see beauty." The following week, Mr. Harrison cleared out the front window of his shop and replaced it with 3 of Ellie's paintings. He printed a small handwritten card, "Local Scenes by Ellie Brooks." 2 of the paintings sold within 3 days. The money was more than she made in 2 weeks at the diner. But it wasn't the income that changed her. It was the validation. Someone saw value in what she saw. For the first time in forever, she didn't feel like a shadow. She felt like a voice, a vision, a person. It became a spark. She enrolled in a business course at the community college, learned how to price, market, and brand her work. She launched an Instagram account, posting clean, high-resolution images of her art. She stopped browsing local art fairs and started booking her own booth. Her style stood out. She blended her classical art history training with the raw, weathered textures of her city. She began integrating salvaged materials, scrap metal, shattered glass, rusted gears, into her paintings, giving them a rich, textured, 3-dimensional finish. Her work became a dialogue between destruction and beauty, between what had been lost and what could still be reborn. It was the story of her own transformation, told in oil, in rust, in every stroke of her brush. And as her art business flourished, so did her confidence. She cut her hair into a sleek, stylish bob that framed her face with bold precision. Her clothes evolved too, vibrant colors, textured fabrics, and one-of-a-kind handcrafted jewelry. that mirrored her creative spirit. She began to love her own company. But she didn't isolate. She built a new circle around her. She grew close to other local artists, to the gruff but warm-hearted owner of the diner, and to the soft-spoken librarian who always seemed to recommend exactly the book she needed. She even began therapy. Unpacking 10 years of emotional trauma wasn't easy. She wept for the woman she had been, for the time she had lost. There were moments in that therapy room when the past threatened to suffocate her. Memories of sharp words, cold stares, and the silence that had hollowed her out. But her therapist sat steady through it all, helping her peel back the layers without shame. For every tear shed, Ellie began to reclaim something she hadn't realized she'd lost. Her voice. Her right to take up space. Her right to matter. But slowly, her therapist helped her see that her gentleness was not weakness. That her longing for connection and safety wasn't needy. She learned to draw lines, to speak up, to value her own instincts. By the end of 5 years, the woman who had once slipped out of Ethan Whitmore's penthouse without a goodbye was gone. In her place stood Ellie Brooks, a name now gaining traction across the national art world. She owned her own gallery now, a breathtaking space in a repurposed warehouse downtown. Her paintings were in demand among collectors and companies alike. She was financially secure, emotionally grounded, and radiant with the kind of calm power she never imagined herself capable of. One morning, she was overseeing the installation of a new exhibit when Ben, her assistant, a bright, art-obsessed college student, walked in holding a glossy magazine. "You're not going to believe this," he said, eyes wide. Page 72. Ellie took the magazine. It was the kind of high-society publication she used to see on the coffee table in her old life. And there, on page 72, was a full-page feature on the upcoming Starlight Gala, the most prestigious charity event in her former city. The event chair was listed as Ethan Whitmore, and on his arm, smiling with polished ease, was Marissa Hale. Now Marissa Whitmore. They'd gotten married. A younger Ellie might have felt a pang, some residual sting of jealousy, but now? Nothing. She stared at the photo with a strange, distant neutrality. They looked like strangers, like mannequins in a world that had long since stopped belonging to her. Ben tapped the page again. "Look," he said, "check out the sponsors." The Kraft Foundation was the headlining donor, as expected, but then Ben's finger stopped on one line. "The official art partner," he said, barely containing a grin. Ellie followed his gaze. There it was, in graceful serif print. Brooks' studio. Her studio. The Starlight Gala, the pinnacle of the world she had once escaped, had chosen her work as the centerpiece. The irony was so rich it almost made her laugh. Ben was still staring at her, waiting for some kind of reaction. He didn't know her story. To Ben, this was just a massive professional break, but for Ellie it was something else entirely. A slow smile spread across her lips, real, confident, and unshakably certain. The chrysalis hadn't just cracked, it had shattered. And from its ruins emerged something fierce, radiant, and completely her own. There had been a time she couldn't imagine walking the same streets as Ethan again, couldn't picture herself breathing the same rarefied air. But now, that fear had been replaced by something stronger. Not vengeance, not bitterness, just clarity. She no longer needed to prove anything, she simply needed to show up. "Ben," she said, her voice calm and steady. "Call them, tell them we accept, and book me a ticket." She met his eyes, unflinching. "It's time I went back." The ballroom of the Astoria Hotel shimmered like a galaxy spun from crystal. Chandeliers rained frozen light onto the polished marble floor, their prisms scattering stars across gowns and tuxedos worth more than some homes. The air buzzed with curated elegance, old money, new wealth, quiet rivalries, and champagne flutes never allowed to go empty. This was the Starlight Gala. Ethan Whitmore's annual tribute to his own legacy. An evening where influence and power waltzed under the guise of philanthropy. At the center of the room, behind velvet ropes, stood the artistic showpiece of the night. Calling it a sculpture felt insufficient. It was a living installation, an immersive work titled Echoes of Rebirth. 3 towering translucent panels, each over 10 feet high, were curved in a slow arc. Encased within the gleaming resin were echoes of another world. Rusted cogs seemingly suspended mid-air, oxidized copper filigree, and shattered shards of iridescent glass. But woven between the decay were vibrant veins of color, streaks of sapphire, deep emerald, and searing crimson. Hidden lighting pulsed from within, shifting the hues as if the whole piece were breathing. It was haunting and magnificent, a declaration that from ruin, something astonishing could emerge. The program credited the piece to an up-and-coming artist named Ellie Brooks. The name meant absolutely nothing to Ethan Whitmore. He had barely skimmed the proposal, leaving the artsy stuff to the gala committee. His focus was where it had always been, on the multi-million-dollar donations he planned to secure from the city's elite. He stood near the entrance, surveying the ballroom like a monarch presiding over his court. At his side, Marissa Whitmore glistened in a silver gown that clung like molten metal. Her blonde hair was swept into an elaborate updo, and the diamond necklace resting on her collarbone, Ethan's latest "I love you," sparkled like a spotlight. She was the perfect accessory. Poised, beautiful, untouchable. "Darling, you've outdone yourself," she whispered, her fingers curling around his arm. "Everyone's here," Ethan said, his gaze sweeping across the ballroom, mentally calculating net worths like inventory. "Of course they are. It's the only ticket that matters." He was in his element, admired, influential, utterly in control. The ghost of his first wife, the quiet, forgettable woman whose name he hadn't spoken in over 5 years, was a distant memory. He'd heard she moved somewhere unimpressive, gray, small. He'd paid her off with a pittance, just enough to meet the terms of the prenup. His lawyers handled everything. Clean, efficient, a surgical cut from a part of his life that no longer served him. And then she walked in. He didn't notice at first. What caught his attention was the ripple that moved through the room, the subtle hush, the instinctive shifting of bodies, the pause and idle chatter. It was the kind of moment usually reserved for a celebrity or visiting royalty. His eyes followed the collective gaze to the ballroom's grand entrance. The woman standing there wasn't a movie star. He would have remembered her. No, this was something different. She wore a floor-length gown of deep emerald silk. It didn't shimmer or cling, it flowed. The color was bold, unapologetic, but the cut was effortlessly elegant, understated in a way that demanded attention without asking for it. She moved with a confidence that silenced the air around her. Not loud, not grand, but absolute. Every step was a quiet declaration. I belong. Her dark bob shone under the chandelier lights, framing a face sculpted with precision, defined cheekbones, a strong jaw, and eyes that didn't need to speak loudly to be heard. Around her neck hung a single silver pendant, handcrafted, striking, echoing the very sculpture that dominated the room. She wasn't conventionally glamorous like Marissa. She wasn't glossy. She was powerful, purposeful. She was art. "Who is that?" Marissa whispered, an edge in her voice. Her instincts flared, some primal unease tightening in her chest. This woman wasn't competing in the same arena. She wasn't even on the same field. For the first time all evening, Marissa felt the chill of irrelevance crawl up her spine. Ethan narrowed his eyes, shrugged. "No idea. Probably the artist. The one who did the sculpture, I guess." He dismissed her with the same careless arrogance he applied to everyone he considered beneath him. To him, she was staff. Just another decoration. The woman began to move through the ballroom, not performing, not socializing. She walked as though the room belonged to her, posture flawless, eyes forward, a faint, composed smile on her lips. People stepped aside for her without realizing it. Their eyes trailed after her. She was headed straight toward the sculpture. Her path would carry her directly past Ethan and Marissa. As she drew closer, an inexplicable tension coiled in Ethan's chest, a flicker of something unnameable stirring just beneath his carefully curated certainty. As she drew closer, Ethan finally got a clear look at her face. There was something, just a flicker, in the curve of her smile, in the set of her eyes, like a half-remembered tune from a long-forgotten dream, a whisper of familiarity that hovered just out of reach. Ethan dismissed it as a trick of the light. She was only a few steps away now. The event photographer, sensing a moment, lifted his camera. The chairman of the gala, his stunning wife, and the enigmatic artist, an irresistible frame. Marissa, ever aware of appearances, flashed a radiant smile. Ethan assumed his usual expression of gracious authority. After all, this woman, this artist, was technically here at his invitation. Ellie Brooks paused as she reached them. Her gaze drifted across Marissa's shimmering gown, then to Ethan's flawlessly tailored tuxedo. It was a glance of perfect neutrality, cool, detached. And then, for just an instant, her eyes met Ethan's, and he felt nothing, no recognition, no flicker of memory. He was staring at a stranger, an intriguing one, maybe, but still a stranger. "A remarkable piece," Ethan said, his voice broad and performative. He motioned vaguely toward the sculpture. "A real conversation starter. Well done." It was the kind of praise one gives to a florist or a caterer. Polite, hollow. Her smile didn't falter. "Thank you, Mr. Whitmore," she said. Her voice was low, smooth, with a resonance that was both soft and immovable. "I'm glad it meets your standards." Then she turned to Marissa. "Mrs. Whitmore," she said, offering a nod so subtle it was almost imagined. "Your necklace is lovely." Marissa instinctively lifted her hand to the diamonds at her throat. "Thank you. Ethan has excellent taste." The artist's lips curled just slightly. A flicker of amusement. Or was it something else? "He certainly does," she said. And then she was gone. She drifted past them without effort, without pause, her path pulling her back toward the centerpiece sculpture. The photographer, disappointed by the lack of interaction, slowly lowered his camera. Ethan turned back to the room, already brushing off the encounter. But something lingered, a whisper of memory. Brooks. Ellie Brooks. A common enough name. But her voice? "He certainly does." It echoed somewhere in the back of his mind, like a phantom tapping on closed doors. Beside him, Marissa was talking animatedly about someone's unfortunate footwear choice. But Ethan wasn't listening. He was watching the artist. She was being welcomed by the director of the City Museum of Modern Art, a man who rarely gave time to emerging talent. Something about her held the room. The museum director, the very same man who had snubbed Ethan at a fundraiser just last month, was now shaking hands with the artist, his face lit with unmistakable admiration. Ellie. The name echoed in Ethan's mind, louder now. Ellie, the fundraiser for the Children's Hospital. "I'm helping to organize it." The memory surged forward. The quiet woman on the cream sofa, the tight bun, the beige cardigan. The voice he'd dismissed without looking up from his phone. The wife he had erased. His blood turned cold. He looked across the ballroom at the woman now laughing easily at something the museum director had said. Her whole face came alive with the sound, vibrant, luminous. He tried to overlay the image of Evelyn, his timid, subdued first wife, onto the elegant woman in emerald silk. But it didn't work. They were two entirely different people. And yet, he saw it. The faint scar just above her left eyebrow from a childhood fall she once told him about. The subtle tilt of her head when she was deeply focused. The exact, almost unreal shade of deep chocolate in her eyes, now gleaming under the chandeliers. His heart lurched, not with recognition but with a desperate ache. He felt the sting of every second he'd overlooked her, every moment he'd chosen indifference over presence. The whiskey in Ethan's stomach soured. The glittering ballroom, once his throne room, now felt airless, suffocating. He turned to Marissa, his face drained of color. "What is it, darling?" she asked, her smile faltering. "You look like you've seen a ghost." His eyes didn't move. They were fixed on the artist, the stranger, the woman he had spoken to like staff, the woman he had failed to recognize, the woman who, undeniably, impossibly, was his first wife. "I think I have," he whispered. And just like that, the weight came crashing down. It wasn't a lightning bolt. It was slower, colder. Like icy seawater rising up, stealing the breath from his lungs. One moment, Ethan Whitmore was the master of the evening, the orchestrator of glamour and influence. The next, he was just a man staring into the chasm of his own failure. He could almost hear the echo of his past mistakes reverberating through the chandeliers, a haunting symphony of regret. "That's not possible," he muttered, to no one in particular. "What's not possible?" Marissa asked sharply, irritation sharpening her voice. His sudden pallor was ruining the photo ops. "Ethan, what is wrong with you?" He couldn't answer. His mind was a storm of broken images. Ellie walking out of their penthouse with a small suitcase. Ellie now, commanding a room with her presence, holding court beside her sculpture. Two versions of the same woman. And yet his mind refused to stitch them together. They were incompatible realities, and he had never seen her until it was far, far too late. How could the dull, colorless caterpillar he'd so easily cast aside have become this? Not just a butterfly, but one with wings of steel. Ethan watched as the city's mayor, A man he'd been trying to get on the phone for 6 months crossed the room to greet Ellie Brooks with a warm, enthusiastic handshake. A moment later, the chairman of the board of the city's largest bank joined the conversation, laughing at something she said. She wasn't orbiting this world anymore. She was its gravitational center. "I need a drink," Ethan muttered, brushing past a puzzled Marissa and heading toward the bar. He ordered a scotch, neat, and downed it in a single burning gulp. It didn't calm him. If anything, it made the edges of his panic even sharper. He had dismissed her. He had looked into the face of the woman who once shared his life, his home, his name, for a decade, and treated her like a background detail. A wonderful piece, well done. His own voice echoed in his ears. Smug, patronizing. It made him sick. He hadn't just failed to recognize her. He had publicly minimized her. On the most high-profile night of his calendar, in front of everyone who mattered. Across the ballroom, Marissa's instincts were already in overdrive. She'd seen that look on Ethan's face, and this wasn't about the market or a missed deal. This was personal. Her eyes snapped back toward the artist, Ellie Brooks. Who is she? The name tugged at something in her memory, but it didn't click. Marissa didn't keep track of the unremarkable. If someone didn't serve a purpose in her curated, high-polished life, they didn't exist. And a plain, overlooked first wife certainly didn't make the cut. She pulled aside one of the gala committee assistants, a bright-eyed woman named Tiffany. "That artist, Ellie Brooks," Marissa said, her tone breezy, detached. "What's her story?" Tiffany lit up. "Oh, she's amazing. Total prodigy. Kind of came out of nowhere a few years back. Her gallery, Brooks Studio, is one of the hottest in the country right now." Tiffany lowered her voice as if sharing a scandal. She turned down a private commission from a sheikh in Dubai to do this piece. For us. Can you believe that? We are so lucky. Marissa's jaw tightened. Tiffany leaned in, eyes sparkling. "And between us, Mr. Whitmore got her for a steal. Her usual fee for something this size? Nearly double what the committee approved." Marissa's smile froze. Not only was this woman a success, she was a bargain. Julian, no Ethan, had stumbled into it, and the thought burned. Marissa thanked Tiffany and made her way back to Ethan's side at the bar. "So, apparently the artist is kind of a big deal," she said, attempting to sound indifferent. "Funny, I don't recall you ever mentioning her." Ethan's fingers clenched around his empty glass, his knuckles white. "Her name didn't register. The committee handled it." "The committee?" Marissa echoed, disbelief seeping into her voice. "Ethan, you approve every single item on the budget. You always know who you're hiring." She paused, something cold and terrible dawning behind her eyes. Fragments of old conversations surfaced, Ethan grumbling about a divorce. The name. A quiet, artsy woman. Ellie. Her blood ran cold. "Oh my God," she whispered, eyes wide as she looked from Ethan's ashen face to the woman across the ballroom. "That's her. That's your first wife." The accusation hung heavy in the air between them, undeniable and ugly. It wasn't just that Ethan hadn't recognized his ex-wife. It was that the woman he'd replaced her with, the woman standing beside him now, was being obliterated in comparison. Marissa, wrapped in couture and diamonds, suddenly felt ornamental. Manufactured. Ellie Brooks radiated something deeper, something unpurchasable, something real. Her light came from within, and the fallout began almost instantly. Whispers first, small, sharp. The story was too perfect to resist. Ethan Whitmore, the man who prided himself on knowing everyone, everything, had completely dismissed the star of his own gala. At first, people murmured about arrogance, typical Ethan. But then someone connected the dots. An older board member with a longer memory remembered the first Mrs. Whitmore, that shy woman who used to stand quietly at Ethan's side during these very events. The story twisted, deepened, exploded. He hadn't just dismissed the artist, he had dismissed his own ex-wife, and hadn't even realized it. The air in the ballroom shifted, subtle but unmistakable. The stares that had once been admiring now carried a glint of amusement. Speculation, schadenfreude. Eyes darted between Ethan and Marissa, their strained smiles stretching too tight. Then to Ellie, who remained blissfully unbothered, surrounded by curators, donors, and admirers, calmly speaking about her work. The contrast was lethal. He was the past, loud, arrogant, clumsy. She was the future, composed, magnetic, undeniable. Ethan felt it like a drop in barometric pressure, the collapse of control. He tried to recover, to glide into conversations like before. But the swagger was gone, and the laughs no longer followed. His handshake no longer held power. It felt desperate. As Ethan moved from group to group, he saw the subtle shifts, the whispered glances behind half-raised champagne flutes, the smiles that didn't quite reach the eyes. He was no longer the room's master. He was a punchline. And Marissa? She was trapped in a nightmare she hadn't seen coming. Her entire identity, Mrs. Ethan Whitmore, the admired, envied woman who had won, was crumbling. Tonight, she was anything but a winner. She felt it in the way the other women looked at her. Tight smiles, eyes filled with thinly veiled pity. She saw it in the smirks. They were all thinking the same thing. He left his wife for you, and his wife came back a queen. The ballroom's glamour no longer shielded her. The chandeliers above might as well have been floodlights, exposing every crack in her carefully crafted image. The diamond necklace around her neck felt like a chain. Gaudy. Heavy. Then came the final blow. The live auction. The last item up for bid, a private commission from the artist herself, Ellie Brooks. The announcement sent a wave of excitement through the room. Bidding started instantly and escalated fast. 6 figures, climbing higher, in a reckless attempt to claw back some semblance of control, to make a statement, he wasn't sure to whom. Ethan raised his hand. 200,000, he called, voice louder than necessary. A hush fell. Eyes turned, first to him, then to Ellie, who stood calmly near the stage. She met his bid with a look impossible to read. A flicker of something. Surprise? Amusement? She didn't react. Another bidder countered. 225. 250. Ethan shot back, his face flushing. Marissa grabbed his arm. Ethan, stop, she hissed. What are you doing? He shook her off. This wasn't just about the art. This was about rewriting the narrative. About putting his stamp, his name, on her success. About proving to himself more than anyone that he could still take up space in her world. That he still mattered. The bidding surged. 300, 350. Ethan found himself locked in battle with a rival. A fellow tech billionaire he despised. A war of egos was unfolding on the ballroom floor. 500,000. Ethan bellowed, voice cracking on the last syllable. A collective gasp swept the room. The auctioneer turned to Ellie. She gave the slightest shake of her head. Then she stepped forward. She took the microphone, her presence effortlessly commanding. "Thank you all for your incredible generosity," she said, her calm voice filling the hushed space. "And thank you, Mr. Whitmore, for your enthusiastic bidding." She let the words linger. Then came the final blow. "However, I must respectfully withdraw this item from the auction." Gasps. Confused murmurs. She raised one hand for silence. "My studio has a policy," Ellie said, her voice composed, resonant. She swept her gaze across the stunned audience, and then, for one brief, devastating moment, her eyes met Ethan Whitmore's. "We do not engage in private commissions secured through public spectacle," she continued. "My art is not a trophy to be won in a bidding war." A pause. Then a soft, unwavering smile. "Instead, I'll be donating an original piece directly to the Children's Hospital." Another ripple through the room, this time of admiration. "Thank you." With that, she handed the microphone back to the speechless auctioneer. She gave the crowd one final nod, turned, and walked gracefully off stage. She never looked back at Ethan. She didn't need to. The humiliation was absolute. She hadn't just rejected his money, she had rejected his entire world, his values, his games, his power. And she had done it not with malice, but with something far more cutting, grace. The kind that made every person in that ballroom suddenly see who truly held the power. In one elegant, poised move, she had exposed the truth. His desperate bid was nothing but a gaudy, pathetic plea. And she checkmated him without ever raising her voice. The fallout wasn't whispers anymore. It was thunder. And Ethan and Marissa Whitmore stood at ground zero. The days following the Starlight Gala were a full-blown social and professional meltdown for them. The story spread like fire, retold at brunches, boardrooms, and cocktail hours, with dramatic flair added each time. It had all the ingredients of a perfect scandal. Ego, revenge, grace, and a spectacular fall from power. Ethan wasn't just the man who failed to recognize his ex-wife. He was the man who tried to buy her publicly and got annihilated. The narrative had been stripped from him. He was no longer the author. He was a cautionary tale in Ellie Brooks's epic. He was no longer a mogul. He was a meme, a cautionary whisper that followed clinking glasses and well-rehearsed smiles. His phone, once a symphony of calls, texts, deals, and approvals, fell into a cold, echoing silence. The first clear sign of collapse came 3 days after the gala. Ethan was finalizing a major real estate deal, a joint venture with Marcus Thorne, a longtime associate. The final call should have been a formality. Instead, Marcus's tone was distant. "The board's getting cold feet," he said flatly. Ethan blinked. "Cold feet? Marcus, the numbers are rock solid. This is a guaranteed win." A pause. "It's not about numbers anymore," Marcus said. "It's about optics." "Optics?" Ethan repeated, incredulous. "Everyone at the club was talking about the gala this weekend. The whole thing. My partners feel your personal brand's become volatile." "My personal brand?" Ethan scoffed. The phrase tasted foul. "What does that have to do with a property venture?" "It has everything to do with it," Marcus replied, voice final. "We're pulling out, I'm sorry." Click. Silence. The line went dead. Ethan stared at his phone, a vein pulsing angrily at his temple. He had been dismissed, measured, and found lacking. Not long after, the board of his own charitable foundation called an emergency meeting to discuss the reputational risk. The empire he thought he'd built with sheer brilliance to be a house of mirrors, held up only by perception. And that perception had been obliterated. For the first time in his adult life, Ethan wasn't feared or revered. He was pitied, or worse, mocked. For Marissa, the reckoning was no less brutal and far more personal. Her social currency had collapsed overnight. Determined to stand tall, she forced herself to attend a luncheon for the city ballet. She walked in, chin lifted, bracing herself for whispers. But the reality was worse. She wasn't seated at the head table. She wasn't even close. She was quietly placed at a side table near the service doors. The women who once clung to her every word now offered tight, polite smiles if they acknowledged her at all. The air buzzed not with admiration but polite discomfort. She could feel the conversation stall each time she approached, like a ghost walking into a room that didn't want her. And then, like clockwork, came Genevieve Adder, a woman Marissa had long envied and tried to outshine. "Marissa, darling," Genevieve cooed, her smile like a blade. "I saw the photos from the gala. Such a dramatic evening." Her eyes sparkled with malice. "And your husband's first wife. What a revelation. So much talent. Just goes to show you never really know what someone's capable of." Every word hit its mark. They weren't compliments, they were coronations for Ellie, and a burial for her. Marissa was no longer the golden girl. She was a side note, a cautionary tale in Ellie Brooks's triumph. Their once iconic penthouse became a hollow echo of their former life. It was still vast, still filled with luxury. But now, it felt like a polished prison. The silence that used to be Ellie's torment now blanketed them. They moved through the apartment like strangers, careful not to speak more than necessary. One night, Ethan stormed into the kitchen and slammed a glossy lifestyle magazine onto the marble island. The cover featured a 10-page spread titled "The Phoenix of the Art World," an in-depth feature on Ellie Brooks. Stunning photos of her work, her gallery, and Ellie herself, serene, self-assured, powerful, stared up at him. "Look at this," he snapped, his voice echoing harshly. "They're calling her a phoenix. So what does that make me?" "The fire," Marissa replied, barely looking up from her wine glass, her eyes hollow. "What?" Ethan barked. "It makes you the fire," she said quietly. "And me, the parrot." The words hit the marble island harder than the magazine. A parrot. Her voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. The devastation came not in volume, but in clarity, cutting through the sterile kitchen like glass. Ethan's rage exploded. "I gave you everything. You were a glorified event planner when I met you." Marissa didn't flinch. "And you," she said, voice razor sharp, "were married to a masterpiece. You were too blind to see." Marissa shrieked, her voice cracking under the weight of rage and despair. "You didn't just ruin yourself, Ethan. You ruined me." She blamed him for everything, his arrogance, his carelessness, his refusal to see what was slipping through his fingers. Her words weren't just accusations. They were a plea, a howl of betrayal from someone who had built her entire life on the illusion of being chosen, only to watch that illusion burn. Ethan, in the twisted logic only narcissism could justify, blamed her for not being enough, for somehow letting Ellie eclipse her, eclipse them, so completely. In his eyes, Marissa hadn't lost the game. She had failed to play it well enough. 2 weeks after the gala, Ethan finally cracked. driven by a toxic cocktail of wounded pride, festering rage, and a strange, unfamiliar ache he couldn't name. He did the one thing his lawyers would have begged him not to do. He went to Ellie's gallery. Brooke's studio was nothing like the sterile, intimidating spaces he was used to. It was open, bright, polished concrete floors and lofty ceilings that drank in the light. The walls were alive with color, texture, movement. It breathed. It felt like stepping into someone's soul and realizing too late that you'd once owned the key but never opened the door. And at the back, in a sleek, glass-walled office, sat Ellie. She wasn't painting. She was mid-conference call, speaking with a man on a large monitor. Even from across the room, Ethan could see it, the way the man looked at her, not just with respect, but admiration. She laughed, freely, fully. A sound that echoed faintly in the gallery air. She looked effortless. She looked happy. She saw him. Her gaze didn't falter. She held up one finger without breaking stride in her conversation, finished her point, and said, "Talk soon, Thomas." Then she clicked off the call. Only then did she look directly at him. Her expression was calm, controlled, the way someone might regard a vaguely familiar face on the subway. "Ethan," she said simply. It wasn't a greeting, not a question, just fact. Her voice was neutral, steady. "To what do I owe the pleasure?" He hovered awkwardly at the threshold of her office. The roles had flipped entirely. He was the outsider now. She was the one with power. "Ellie, we need to talk," he said, voice dry and low. "Do we?" she asked, leaning back in her chair. "I feel like we said everything that needed to be said 10 years ago. And then again 5 years ago. And well, 2 weeks ago at the gala." Her words weren't cruel, but they cut with surgical precision. "That night, at the gala," Ethan began. "You didn't recognize me," she finished, a faint smile ghosting across her lips. "I know. It was quite obvious." She tilted her head slightly, still watching him with cool detachment. "In a way, I should thank you," she added. "It was the most honest moment we've had in more than a decade." There was no anger in her voice, no bitterness, and somehow that was more devastating than any tearful tirade. He had come armed with the tools of his old world: charm, dominance, persuasion. None of them worked here. He had come braced for confrontation, for drama, apologies, maybe even hope. What he got was indifference. Ethan hadn't expected this. This serene, untouchable calm. "I don't understand how this happened," he said, motioning helplessly toward the gallery, toward her, toward the impossible transformation. "The woman I knew, she was quiet, simple. She never could have done all this." For the first time, something shifted in Ellie's expression. Not anger, something deeper. A profound, mournful sadness. The kind that comes not from heartbreak, but from the recognition of just how little someone had ever truly known you. "The woman you knew," she said quietly, "was someone you never actually saw." She held his gaze. "You saw what you wanted to see, a quiet, convenient accessory. You didn't see the artist, the dreamer, the person with her own fire and hunger and joy." She walked over to the window, staring out at the street below. "You didn't nurture the plant, Ethan, and then you were shocked when it didn't bloom under your shadow." A beat. "You didn't break me," she added, her voice softer now. "You erased me. You erased everything I was." She turned back to face him. "And in doing that, you gave me the greatest gift of all, a blank canvas." A small smile touched her lips, wry, almost bittersweet. "I got to paint myself back into existence, in my colors, on my terms." Her words weren't triumphant. They were reflective, rich with hard-won clarity, the kind that only rises from deep ruin. Panic began to take root in Ethan's chest. This wasn't how it was supposed to go. "I want to fix this," he blurted, the words bitter and foreign in his mouth. "I made a mistake, a huge mistake. He swallowed. "I miss you." Ellie turned from the window, and for a moment she was still. Then she laughed, not cruelly, but like someone genuinely stunned by the absurdity of what they'd just heard. "Oh, Ethan," she said, shaking her head. "No, you don't." Her voice was kind, and that made it worse. "You don't miss me. You don't even know me." She stepped closer, not angry, just steady. "You miss the idea of me. You miss the comfort, the silence, the woman who kept your life running so you could chase your ambitions and your distractions unbothered." She paused. "And now you miss what I have. You see my success, the attention, the respect, and you want to possess it, just like you tried to buy my art at that auction." Her eyes narrowed slightly. "You haven't changed at all." Her tone wasn't cruel. It was honest. That was the most painful part. There was no venom, just truth. And that's when the front door to the gallery opened. Marissa. She looked awful. Her designer coat hung loose on her frame, and her heels clicked unevenly across the polished floor. Her face was a mask of fear, fatigue, and fury. She locked eyes with Ethan, and the fire came rushing back. "I knew it," she hissed, her voice shaking. "I knew you'd come crawling back here." Ellie turned to look at the both of them, their stunned and broken faces, and sighed. It was the long, tired sigh of a woman caught in a story she'd already read too many times. "This," Ellie said, motioning calmly between the two of them, "has absolutely nothing to do with me. Not anymore." She walked over to her desk, grabbed her bag, and slung it over her shoulder. "I have a lunch meeting at the Modern," she added casually, "with the curator from Tate." She let that detail settle, effortless, devastating. A quiet confirmation of the orbit she now lived in. A reminder that while they were unraveling, she was still rising, still moving forward, still being chosen. "If you're interested in purchasing a piece," she said, gesturing toward the walls, "Ben can assist you." Then she turned to Marissa. Her gaze was steady, not cruel, but unflinchingly honest. "And for what it's worth, he's your problem now. You built your house on stolen land. Don't be surprised when the foundation crumbles." The words weren't loud, but they landed like thunder. Truth wrapped in silk, slicing clean. With that, she walked past them, heels clicking softly on the polished floor, making her way to the front of the gallery. At the door, she paused. They stood there, Ethan and Marissa, caught in the silence, surrounded by paintings born from her pain, now celebrated as masterpieces. They looked small, diminished, left behind in a space too bright, too clean for them to exist in comfortably. "Goodbye, Ethan," she said. The finality in her voice was like a closing book, a fading spotlight, a door quietly but irrevocably shut. It wasn't bitter, it wasn't dramatic, it was absolute. Then she stepped outside, into the golden afternoon light, leaving them behind, forever frozen in the afterglow of a woman they'd failed to recognize, until it was far, far too late. They still had their money, their penthouse, and their misery. Ellie had herself, and that meant she had everything. She had won. And there you have it, a story of how betrayal can be the forge of unimaginable strength. Ellie's journey wasn't just about a transformation on the outside, it was a reclamation of her soul. She showed us all that your worth is never defined by someone else's failure to see it. Ethan and Marissa were left clinging to the hollow shells of their choices, while Ellie built an empire from the ruins they left behind. What did you think of her epic comeback? Who do you think was the real villain in this story? So the story is over. Our wonderful friends, are you still here at this hour? If you're really here, still listening, still reading, then maybe, just maybe, something about Ellie's journey touched your heart. And if it did, then let's sit with that feeling for a moment. This wasn't just a tale of revenge or redemption. It was a reminder that healing doesn't always roar. Sometimes it's quiet. Sometimes it walks away with dignity. And sometimes it returns with grace so radiant it blinds those who once looked right through it. Ellie's story is about what happens when we stop waiting to be seen and start seeing ourselves. It's about reclaiming the narrative others tried to write for us. As Rupi Kaur once said, if you were born with the weakness to fall, you were born with the strength to rise. Ellie rose, not just in the eyes of the world, but in her own. And that's the power that matters most. So if you've ever felt invisible, unheard, or undervalued, remember this story. Let it remind you that your light doesn't need permission to shine, that what someone else failed to recognize in you doesn't diminish your worth. It only reveals their blindness. And if you, too, are holding broken pieces of yourself, unsure what comes next, take heart in this truth. Even shattered glass can become stained glass windows. If this touched something in you, please like, share, and subscribe to the channel. Not for the algorithm, but because someone out there might need to hear this too. Someone who's standing at the edge of their own transformation. We're here, together. And your comeback? It's coming. Until next time, take care of your heart. And remember, you are the masterpiece. The world will catch up.